Welcome to How the Great Religions Began. Book 1. The Religions of India. Part 2. Jainism. The Religion of Mahavira the Conqueror. Of Prince Mahavira the Conqueror, it is said, he was a speaker. He was a great speaker. He spoke the truth. Jainism, the religion of Mahavira the Conqueror. Part 1. In the days of the Buddha. Prince Gautama, the Buddha, was not the only one who tried to improve the religion of the Hindus. Even before the Buddha was born, there were people who hated idol worship and the division of people into castes, and who tried to reform Brahmanism. The most noted of these reformers was known as the Lord Mahavira. Lord is a spiritual master. The story of the Lord Mahavira is so much like that of the Buddha that it seems almost the same story, only a little changed. And that is just what people outside of India thought until about 50 years ago. But since then, a number of scholars have carefully studied many books about the life and teachings of Lord Mahavira and proven that he was a real person who lived when the Buddha was alive. That he was older than the Buddha, and that he died before the Buddha. And this is the story of Lord Mahavira. And remember that not all that's attributed to spiritual leaders is actually of those spiritual leaders. So you're seeing one area versus another area formulate another path. But the bridge builders, the last two, were likely different than the first 22. And the two are the ones that we're going to possibly find out about. Part 2. The Brave Prince of Asali. In the year 600 BCE, over 2,500 years ago, the people, over 2,600 years ago, the people of the kingdom of Magadha in the north of India gathered in their capital, Vaisali, for a great celebration. The streets were lit with many colored lanterns. Sacrifices were offered up at the altars in the temples. Hymns were sung before Brahma, the creator, and before Vishnu, the preserver, and before all the other idols in the land. Now, people can refer to God all as one without idols. So there's some problems with thinking, oh, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, they're all different idols. No, not at all. And King Sriyama sent out his ministers to distribute alms among the poor and to set all prisoners free. This was not a religious holiday that the king and his people were celebrating, nor did they celebrate a great victory over their enemies, for in those days in India, the little kingdoms lived peacefully with their neighbors. All that festivity was to celebrate the birth of a prince. And if we refer to Mazdayasnaha or Mazdayasnism, is because because the celebrations, the praise, and the songs are for God, not secular causes. So that is a particular deviation mentioned here. From this moment, and for 12 years, I shall not utter a single word, After making the vow of silence, Mahavira started out as a wanderer over the land, as one of the many thousands of monks in India. When passing through towns and villages, Mahavira would stretch out his cup for kind people to put into it some food. And in the woods he lived upon wild fruit and berries. Most of the time he spent in the woods or up in the mountains, sitting alone and thinking about the teachings of his religion. For 12 years Mahavira went about without once uttering a single word, but if he said nothing in those long years, he thought a great deal. And the longer he thought about his religion, Brahmanism, the more he realized that many of its teachings were wrong. Then he thought of ways of changing and improving the teachings of his people's religion. Now, a real prophet doesn't just philosophize his way of, oh, I'm going to change this, I'm going to keep this. No, it doesn't work that way. Once, during his wanderings, Mahavira came to a grazing field outside a village, where a shepherd was looking after a small flock of sheep. "If you will look after my flock while I run down to the village for food," said the shepherd to Mahavira, "I'll bring some for you too." Mahavira nodded his head in consent, and the shepherd left. Soon afterwards a wolf came out of the woods, and before Mahavira could drive him off, killed the lamb and carried it off. When the shepherd returned and found one of his lambs gone, he demanded an explanation, but Mahavira remained silent. "What? Will you not tell me what became of my lamb, you thief?" the shepherd shouted, and struck Mahavira over the head with his staff. Mahavira could have explained what became of the lamb, but he did not want to break his vow of silence. He was also a much stronger man than the shepherd, and could have defended himself, but he made a vow not to protect himself against any evil that might befall him, and that's a foolish vow. Now, not being evil in your level of retaliation, yeah, but not protecting yourself, no, that's not right to do. The shepherd kept striking Mahavira until he began to bleed. Then he suddenly stopped and looked at the bleeding monk with fear in his eyes. "You're the first man I ever met," he said in a trembling voice, "who would not protect himself, or else run away. You must be a very holy man." Mahavira did not answer, but arose and started to walk away. The shepherd ran after him and asked his forgiveness. Mahavira nodded his head as a sign that he forgave him, and walked on. The shepherd watched the monk disappear over the hill, and murmured, "This monk has taught me a great lesson. Silence is stronger than words." And in ritual prayer, silence is an important part. Mahavira wandered on, thinking, "This incident has taught me a great lesson. Humility is better than pride, and peace is stronger than anger." At the end of the 12 years, Mahavira did not return home to his family in Vaisali, but he went out over the land to spread the ideas that he had patiently thought out during his years of silence. From place to place he went, preaching to all who would listen to him. Many of his ideas were not new to the people, because they were part of their religion, Brahmanism, or other reformers before Mahavira had preached them. But some of Mahavira's ideas were quite new. "Mahavira is a great speaker," the people said to each other. "He speaks the truth." Many of them became his followers, and with these he organized a brotherhood of monks, and a sisterhood of nuns. Within yourself lies salvation is part 4. But first, continuing part 2, the king already had one son to succeed him to the throne after his death. That was his second son, who was named Vardhamana. Many holy men from along the Ganges and the Himalayan mountains came to see the baby prince and foretold a great future for him. When Prince Vardhamana was still young, one teacher taught him how to use bow and arrow. One teacher taught him how to manage wild horses, and the royal animal trainer taught him how to manage elephants. One day, Prince Vardhamana was out in the royal gardens, playing with the sons of his father's ministers. What games little boys played in those days, I don't know. I do not know. But whatever games they were, the prince and his playmates were so engrossed in them that they did not hear the crashing sound coming through the garden until it was upon them. When the sound came quite close, and they looked around, they saw an old elephant bull charging directly towards them, madly swinging his powerful trunk. The boys immediately scattered in all directions, screaming with fear, all but the prince. He stood motionless in the same spot. When the elephant rushed up and was almost upon him, Prince Vardhamana caught hold of its trunk in a way that he had been taught by the royal animal trainer, climbed to the elephant's head, and drove him back to the stables, where the keepers soon chained him. The prince said nothing to his parents of what had happened, but the animal trainers came running to the palace to tell of the prince's valor. When the incident became known outside the palace, all the people praised the young prince for his great courage. The prince was given a new name, Mahavira, which means great hero. When Prince Mahavira was 12 years old, he put on the sacred thread, as was the custom, took the vow of allegiance to the religion of his fathers, and was sent to the priest for several years to study the Hindu religion. Prince Mahavira liked to study, but he disliked his teachers. They were all priests, Brahmins, and thought themselves the best people in the world, even better than kings and princes. Many of them were very vain, and that the young prince did not like. But what do you expect with the professional priesthood? But when Mahavira grew up and was 19 years old, he forgot his hatred of the priest, for then he became interested in the lovely prince Yosava. He married her, and they settled in the royal palace with the rest of the royal family. For nearly 10 years, the prince and his family lived happily in the royal palace of the kingdom of Magadha. But then, Part 3, Section 3, the vow of silence. When Prince Mahavira was 28 years old, both his father and his mother died, one immediately after the other. They died not through accident or illness, but from slow starvation. Not that the king and the queen could not get enough to eat, They starved themselves on purpose. In those days, in India, dying from starvation was considered a holy death. King Sriyama and Queen Trisala, who were very religious, starved themselves so that they would die a holy death. Self-abuse is not holy. Well, it's set apart, but it's not what religion is obliged or even allowed upon anyone. The loss of his parents so grieved Prince Mahavira that he went to his older brother, who was now king of Magadha, and said to him, "Brother, to mourn the death of our parents, I wish to take the vow that for 12 years I shall neglect my body, and suffer all calamities arising from divine powers, men or animals." But his brother the king pleaded with him and said, "Vira, the deaths of our parents are still fresh in our memories. Your leaving us at the time would simply make our sorrows more painful." Prince Mahavira consented to remain at home for 2 years. But when the years were over, he left home and went out of the city of Vesali. At the outskirts of the city, he changed his clothes for those of a beggar monk and took another vow, the vow of silence. Section 4 of Part 1 of Book 1. Part 2 of Book 1. Anyways, within yourself lies salvation. Mahavira began his teachings by explaining his belief that all of a man's life was suffering. Birth was suffering, illness was suffering, death was suffering, not getting what one wants is suffering. Where does the suffering of the world come from? Some asked Mahavira. The suffering of the world comes from desire, answered Mahavira. People suffer and are unhappy because they want so many things. Well, that would be the difference between suffering and hardship. Hardship that one has no control over. No matter how much a man gets of food and wealth and fame, he always wants more. Desire then is the cause of all suffering. How are we to do away with suffering? By giving up all desire, Mahavira replied. When a man gives up all desire, then he can prepare himself for the greatest happiness of the world, the greatest happiness of the soul, which is nirvana. What is the way to nirvana? People wanted to know. The way to nirvana, Mahavira told them, is through the 3 jewels of the soul. And these 3 jewels are right conviction, right knowledge, and right conduct. Orthodoxy. Orthopraxy. And science in the middle, Right conduct comes first, and the right conduct of a man is found in the 5 commandments of the soul. Do not kill any living thing or hurt any living thing by word, thought, or deed. We're seeing an influence of the Zoroastrian faith, the so-called Zoroastrian here. But taking it to a certain extreme. Do not steal, do not lie, do not live an unchaste life, and never become intoxicated. Do not covet or desire anything. Nothing wrong with desire in itself, but don't live in jealousy either. Anyone who follows these commandments leads the good life. The Mahavira explained that he did not believe in castes, that he did not believe in idols and idol worship, and that he did not believe in prayer. He did not believe prayers had any value or did anyone any good. Say, this is what happens when people go to extremes embracing their own philosophy. Well, I've thought about things, so that's more important, If you do not believe in the holiness of the caste, and if you do not believe that Brahman created the world, and if you do not believe that worshipping idols or making sacrifices to the gods or saying prayers can do a man any good, where then ought one to search for forgiveness from sin that we may enter nirvana? People asked Mahavira, and Mahavira answered, not in prayer, nor in sacrifice, nor in idol worship will you find forgiveness and the way to the good life. Only by doing good can you reach nirvana. Within yourselves lies salvation. Now, you can pray too for the mercy of God. But 5. Heaven above and hell below. The story of the life of the Mahavira seems almost like the story of the life of the Buddha, with only a few names and facts changed around. Both were Hindu princes. Both were very brave boys. Both earnestly studied their religion. Both were married happily. Both left their homes to become beggar monks. Both found fault with many of the teachings of their religion. And both came back after years of thinking to preach new teachings to their people. Well, not utterly new. I'm sure there were people who said things like this before. I just can't prove it at the moment. I mean, I can't prove it by quoting and stuff. And the teachings of these two princes also seem so much alike that at first they seem like the teachings of one and the same man. And yet they establish two very different religions. They follow the road of Brahmanism as far as karma, reincarnation, and nirvana. But when they come to holiness of caste, salvation by prayer and sacrifice, and the absolute truth of the Vedas, both the Buddha and Mahavira turn away from Brahmanism. They still travel together, both believing that one should not depend upon the help of the gods. Well, there's a difference between, well, I don't believe in these gods, and not believing in God. There's evidence, at least on the Buddha. But live according to the right conviction and right knowledge. When Mahavira and the Buddha start to decide what is the right conduct of the good man, then Mahavira leaves the Buddha, for here they disagree very much. The Buddha travels straight ahead on the middle path of moderation. He believes that all extremes are evil, whereas Mahavira, as you see, turned off on the road of self-torture called asceticism, and he believes that starving and torture help a man to reach the good life. La yuhibbu mu'atadin. Divine love. Inna Allahu yuhibbu mu'atadin. Yeah. Divine love is not, certainly divine love is not for extremism in character. There are other ways in which these two great teachers differ, but this is the most important difference between them. Mahavira, like the Buddha, believed that all living things had souls, that they both learned from Brahmanism. But Mahavira also said that even trees and water and fire and certain vegetables have souls. If a man lived a bad life, he might not only be born again in the body of a pig or a snake or a frog, but he might even be born again to find himself a carrot or a beet or even an onion. Gotta chop an onion and put it in the pot when I'm done with all this. And that was not the worst. Down somewhere, down deep underneath the surface of the earth, were 7 hells, one below the other, and each more terrible. Bad souls that kept on being bad might find themselves in those hells. Mahavira seemed to believe that the souls of the living things had weight, When a soul sins, it becomes heavy and sinks down. If it sins very much, it may sink down, down, down to the seventh hell. But when a soul becomes good and pure, it rises and floats up to one of the 26 heavens that rise one above the other. When a soul becomes so good and so pure that it is light enough to float up to the 26th heaven, then it enters nirvana. For 30 years, Mahavira traveled through India, preaching against idol worship and castes, and explaining his beliefs in heaven and hell. When he was 70 years old, he came to a place called Pava. There, the Lord Mahavira took ill and could not travel any more. He called together his followers and preached to them his last sermon. Of your teachings, O Master, which is the most important to observe? One of his followers asked. Of all my teachings, the first of my 5 commandments is the most important. Do not kill any living thing or hurt any living thing by word, thought, or deed. And that can be qualified, the plants for food, the animals for periodic food. And anyways, I'm not going to go further. Do not kill animals for food. Do not hunt or fish, or ever kill the least creature at any time. Do not kill the mosquito that bites you, or the bee that stings you. Do not go to war. Do not fight back against your attacker. Do not step upon a worm on the roadside. Even the worm has a soul. And, people cover their face, not wanting to inhale bugs. The first commandment of Mahavira is known by his followers as the ahimsa, which means non-injury to anything that has a soul. The next morning, Mahavira was dead. The body of Mahavira was cremated in Pava, and to this day, the town of Pava in the province of Bihar is holy ground for his followers, and a religion for the few is section 6 of part 2 of book 1. When the Lord Mahavira, spiritual master, died, there were about 14,000 monks in his brotherhood. These monks traveled from place to place, teaching the words of their master. The teachings of the Mahavira and all his sermons were gathered into the books called agamas, meaning precepts, and they became the sacred scriptures of his followers. People treat philosophers of all sorts as if they were prophets, and this is going way too far. And it's obviously, as exampled here, gone back a long time. These followers claimed that their Lord Mahavira was not the only founder of their religion. They believed that their religion was founded by 24 Jainas, 24 conquerors. The two were probably different than the others, as exampled, and there's good reason to think that. These last two. Their first conqueror, they claimed, was Lord Adinath, who appeared on earth 100 trillion palyas ago, and their last conqueror was the Lord Mahavira. With this belief that their religion was many, many millions and billions and trillions of years old. And with the agamas as their sacred scriptures, the Jaina monks started out to preach their religion to the world. They prefer being called Jains nowadays, instead of Jainas. When the Lord Mahavira preached, the monks said, not only did all human beings understand him, but even the creatures that crawl and the birds that fly and the souls of the vegetables and the trees, all these understood him, and they understood him because he preached a religion for all things that have souls, a religion which is a blessing to all creatures of the world. But Mahavira's religion could not possibly be a religion for all the people of the world, because the Jainas are not permitted to till the soil for fear of killing worms. They are not permitted to cut down trees. They are not permitted to do anything that requires the use of furnaces for fear of burning flies and insects. They are not permitted to even boil water for the fear of killing insects that are invisible. If all the people in the world were to become Jainas, then no one could grow fruit and vegetables. No one would be able to make bread to eat. People would not be able to make their clothes, warm their houses, travel anywhere, do anything. Before very long they would all die of hunger and thirst and cold. Though in their sacred books the Jainas have written down that their religion was meant as a blessing for all creatures in the world, it was never carried out outside of India, and never became, nor could become, a universal religion. But in India it soon had many followers, and many thousands of followers. At first, the followers of Mahavira did not have any temples, because their teacher did not believe that prayer and gods. But as time went on, they built many temples, and put into them stone images of the Lord Mahavira, as well as of the other 23 Jainas they believed to have come before Mahavira to bring Jainism to the world. In the beginning, these statues were not considered sacred like gods, but in time people began to worship these statues. About 500 years ago, a group of monks broke away from the rest of the Jainas and formed a new sect that had no images or idols in any of their temples. There are now about 2 million Jains in India. They live mostly in Upper Hindustan, along the Ganges River, and in Calcutta. Because their religion forbids them to be farmers, soldiers, teachers, or manufacturers, they are almost all merchants and bankers. They are very wealthy, and the rich Jainas like to spend their money on building temples for their Jainas. There are about 40,000 of their temples in India today. Some of these are very beautiful. Their temples on Mount Abu are talked of as one of the 7 wonders of India. Not only do they build and support temples, but they also keep up their homes for cows and hospitals for sick animals, with wards in them for sick birds, and even wards for sick insects. Queer as their religion may seem to people outside of India, those who have lived among the Jainas find them a very kindly people, and better men because of their religion. Religion to the Jaina is very real, and it rules his behavior, and in everything he does. Every Jain, even today, has 6 daily duties to perform. One of these is to give charity daily, but the Jaina must never think of it as charity. He must feel it his duty to give to the needy all he can give. When they go out to their temples to pray before the images of their 24 Jainas, they ask for the peace and the joy of all other living beings, before they ask for any favors for themselves. And the favors they ask for themselves are not wealth and honor, but the gift of nirvana. They often pray in this very manner: to the Lord